adapting itself to eyesight alone.
We are not made to feel that one part of the canvas demands to be read as a figure, whether abstract or representational, against another part of the canvas read as ground. Line has been purged of its figurative character.
When we read Fried's account, it seems that the success of Pollock's paintings was due to his ability to create an art immersed within the articulation of a totally abstract art, devoid of any fashionable metaphysics of despair. In other words, the culmination of the modernist tradition. This was the condition for the glorification of Pollock. And in fact, his decline as a major artist started, so the story goes, when explicit figuration reappeared in his drawings and paintings of the 1950s, like in his painting of a head produced in 1952. The formalist account can provide us with some perceptive descriptions of the works, but it leaves out or covers over what, in my view, is one of the most important questions: the historical conditions in which these works were produced. The impact of history on the work of the American avant-garde may be symbolized by these photographs of Jackson Pollock. The story of Jackson Pollock's art is a story of a passage from active to passive politics. One shows the artist at work on a 1936 float for the American Communist Party May Day parade. The other, emphasizing the theatricality of the technique, is a shot by the photographer Hans Namath. It shows the painter furiously committed to the production of a modernist drip painting. The important connection between these two moments is often forgotten. What we have to keep in mind is that modernist language was seen by the avant-garde as a solution to their dissatisfaction with overtly socially committed works. Harold Rosenberg wrote in Partisan Review in 1940 that the fall of Paris into the hands of the German army marked the sudden importance of the New World for modern culture. Even conservatives like the owner of Life magazine, Henry Luce, rejected the old isolationist position in 1941 and launched a vigorous internationalist campaign which would lead the country into the American century. This work by Thomas Hart Benton had to be replaced by a more international type of art if modern culture was to survive the war.
Now that America is recognized as a center where art and artists of all the world must meet, it is time for us to accept cultural values on a truly global plane.
The US was seen as the only place left in the Western world for modern culture to survive. The problem was that the shape it would take was still uncertain. What kind of practical, technical, and ideological art practices were open to artists during the war? What kind of possibilities were available to them, let's say during or between 1940 and 1946? There were several options available to American artists, but none of them appealed to those ambitious artists who were still politicized and could not forget the tradition of modern art. Their goal was to avoid the traps of social and national realist propaganda. They wanted to produce an independent art, independent from politics, but still connected with the realities of the 20th century. The already established American Abstract Artists Group, with their modernist stand, could have presented a more suitable alternative for the new American vanguard. But the European characteristics and utopian content of this type of art did not provide a solution to artists who were looking for an original American rejuvenation of cultural production.
We are freeing ourselves of the impediments of memory, associations, nostalgia, legend, myth, or what have you, that have been the devices of Western European painting.
After Nagasaki, Hiroshima, and the Bikini explosion of 1946, the fear of atomic war became pervasive in American society.
Today, when our aspirations have been reduced to a desperate attempt to escape from evil, and times are out of joint, our obsessive subterranean and pictographic images are the expression of the neurosis, which is our reality.
The comment by Michael Fried that Pollock was not concerned with any fashionable metaphysics of despair, but with making the best paintings of which he was capable, shows how far formalist critics have been from understanding the motivations and significance of avant-garde art in the 1940s and 1950s. Certainly, these artists wanted to produce their art out of the modernist tradition. That was, after all, they all agree, the international medium. But by the same token, because of their involvement during the 30s in America with American art practice, and because of their involvement in the 40s and the 50s with politics, they felt that they had to retain somehow, and sometime at all cost, the idea of what they used to call a subject and the subjective.
It seems to me that the modern painter cannot express the present age of the airplane, the atom bomb, and the radio in forms of the Renaissance, or of any other past culture. Each age finds its own technique.
But to find a technique in order to express this new age and the anxiety that went with it was not an easy task. This age of anxiety, as the late 1940s and early 1950s were dubbed by journalists, is indeed an important part of Jackson Pollock's work. Remember, while he was producing his so-called classical pictures in 1948, the atmosphere in America was, as the Washington Post said,
no longer a post-war atmosphere, but to put it bluntly, a pre-war atmosphere.
Since March of 1948, in fact, it had become common to talk about a communist red tide engulfing Western Europe. Newspapers fueled the fear of atomic war while Congress was debating the program of aid to Europe. It is this all-pervasive fear of atomic holocaust that avant-garde artists were trying to integrate in their works. What artists of the avant-garde realized rapidly was that to describe the destruction, the anxiety, the fear, was somehow to accept it, was to transform all this into an empty and acceptable spectacle. Speaking of literature, the critic Dwight MacDonald described this feeling in 1946.
Naturalism is no longer adequate, either aesthetically or morally, to cope with the modern horrors.
Abstraction was for many the only way out of this crisis of representation. An article on the Bikini atomic explosion appeared in the financial magazine Fortune. The article explained to its specialized public that representation faced with atomic age was bankrupt. The illustration of the atomic phenomenon was done by Ralston Crawford, an abstract artist.
He was able, said the caption, to express the complexity of this modern disintegration.
With this in hand, readers of Fortune were introduced to Jackson Pollock's abstractions. How are these problems manifested in Jackson Pollock's works? If we look attentively at the left side of this canvas, we can see, half eaten away by the aggressive swirling lines, a totemic figure with one raised arm. This is very close to the kinds of figuration Pollock had been producing in the early 1940s, in works such as Garden of the Secret, 1943. In 1944, in a drawing titled War, Pollock used the surrealist tradition of mythology allied with the automaticism he learned from artists like Matta and Masson in order to comment on the chaos and destructive forces of war. The same holds true for this untitled drawing of the same year, surprisingly very similar to number 1, 1948. The same totemic figure is on the left, confronted with the same linear expansion, But by comparison with number 1, 1948, the early piece is more narrative in its nightmarish and surrealist quality, with those crowded little heads looming out in the mist of unleashed graffiti. Here, in drawings like number 4, 1948, the still visible anthropomorphic linear forms are crushed, wiped out by a swirl of lines which cancel out the remains of figuration, thus making clear the sort of dialogue he was engaged in with representation. Pollock plays with it, pushing it to the extreme, holding it in check and showing us this process. Pollock's art then becomes an art of blotting and erasure, an art of unwriting, a frenzied elimination of images that would loom up at the slightest provocation in automatic writing. This new type of art was a sort of withdrawal from representation of reality, which, thanks to the energy deployed to express it, left behind no void, but a series of traces. Pollock hoped that through this type of disassociation, he would avoid the banalization of his feelings and keep alive the critical edge provided by Bonnardist language. Why then was his refusal turned into success? To explain this, we need to look at the long chain of events which started with the outbreak of World War II. At that particular time, the American government, for political, strategic, and economical reasons, enlisted the support of the art world and its institutions in this endeavor, and organized in January 1940 the Buy American Art Week. In June 1942, the Museum of Modern Art mounted a major show under the title Road to Victory. The overall layout emphasized the military might and the tranquil strength of the American people. After 1945, with the economy picking up, a new public became interested in buying American art. The middle class was able to replace the art reproductions which had decorated their homes with original paintings, following the advice given in Life magazine. These images were used to decorate the millions of new walls now made available in the new Levytowns of American suburbia. But this was a soft art, a mild modern art, which was miles away from the more aggressive works of Pollock or even of Basiotis and Stamos. In response to this, the liberal cultural elite then turned to a more advanced, audacious and modern art. Their choice was guided by the sophisticated analysis of modern art in the pages of avant-garde magazine Partisan Review and in the liberal Nation. Works by Pollock and other avant-garde artists were used in an advertisement for a building company proposing the construction of exclusive housing, the antithesis of the new middle-class Levytowns. 1948 was the key year for the ascendancy of abstract expressionism. Clement Greenberg was the first critic to announce in Partisan Review the death of Parisian Cubism. He saw it replaced by New York type painting, the new icon of international culture. Parisian qualities that had traditionally been the international standard were suddenly considered too sweet and too weak. They were replaced in Greenberg's writings by American ones. Finish, rationalism were supplanted by an unfinished look, by roughness, by violence. This was a critical moment for Greenberg to make this claim. It was at the peak of the tense political climate which existed between Russia and the US. If, in the general framework of Truman's containment policy, America wanted to impose herself on Europe as the new leader of the Western world, she obviously had to show strength, but not brutality. Force had to be mediated through culture. In discovering these so-called American qualities in Jackson Pollock, Clement Greenberg enshrined the cultural supremacy to America.
When one sees how much the level of American art has risen the last 5 years with the emergence of new talent so full of energy and content as Achille Gorky, Jackson Pollock, David Smith, then the conclusion forces itself, much to our own surprise, that the main premises of Western art have at last migrated to the U.S., along with the center of gravity of industrial production and political power.
The recognition of abstract expressionism as a sign of the new American power was based on what might seem to be a paradox. Greenberg and Rosenberg had been saying since 1947 that avant-garde artists created an art out of their extreme alienation from American culture. What is fascinating is to realize that the avant-garde ideology of refusal, of seeming neutrality, corresponded closely to the anti-communist ideology of the new liberalism, which was then just being defined by the historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. in his popular book, The Vital Center. This position rapidly came to dominate American political life after the second Truman victory in 1948 and after the collapse of what remained of the traditional left. For the new liberal, the modern artist stood as a rampart, as an example of the will to stand out against the uniformity of totalitarianism. Avant-garde art, since 1943, was stripped of its potential critical function by being embraced by anti-communist American liberalism and used to propagate its ideology. For Arthur Schlesinger, the totalitarian man was a cold-eyed, tight-lipped, and insensitive man carved out of wood. Pollock was seen as exuberant, explosive, sincere, an anguished character bordering on insanity who could easily be enrolled as a cold warrior. He became a symbol of free, fragile man, and his work became a symbol of modern anxiety, typical of free society. What we have neglected so far is the top right corner of the picture, where Pollock has carefully placed a series of his handprints. These signs are there to confront us with the real, with the presence of the art maker, but at the same time, by emphasizing the planarity of the surface, the quality of the surface as a wall, Pollock tries to keep us at bay, as he continually does with the cubist structure of the drip. But if this type of frustration was for Pollock a critical tool, a way to express the difficulty to paint, it was seen differently by his public in 1948. Freedom, the historian maintained, was impossible without alienation and anxiety. Anxiety, writes Kierkegaard, is the dizziness of freedom, and anxiety is the official emotion of our times. The negative formal desperation of abstract expressionism was blossoming into positive splendor. By 1948, abstract expressionist painters who still believed that they stood alone, alienated from the entire world, in fact, became caught up in an imperialist machine. Their uncertainty was transformed into a positive weapon. The winds from the center were blowing in the direction of the avant-garde. It seems clear that the group, which would be referred to as the irascibles as late as 1951, was in fact causally installed at the heart of the system by 1948, even if, like here, they were posing as rejected outsiders. By 1951, to be politicized, one's art had to be apolitical. Rothko and Pollock, for example, represented a certain way of American life, as we can see in these photographs from chic magazines in 1950-1951, cultured, luxurious, and voluptuous. America had finally found its own high culture. It was then definitely impossible to use the old description of American culture that had been so popular in the 1930s.
America is the only country in the world that has gone from barbarism to decadence without being civilized in the meantime.
The triumph was indeed complete.
In next week's programme for this course, the eminent art critic Clement Greenberg discusses his views of the practice of art criticism. That's at the same time next Sunday morning. Well, later today, the Arts Foundation course examines the architecture and design of Manchester's Town Hall, which was built as an expression of civic pride. That's King Cotton's Palace at 9:30. But now the course on the rise of scientific Europe traces a link between science and technology, as it shows how the scientific ideas of one of the founders of modern geology were shaped by his work as an inspector of mines in Mining for Science.
These basalt columns are located in the heart of Central Europe, near Freiberg in Saxony, Germany. They tower 40 meters high, and locally they're called the organ pipes. Today they look calm enough, but 200 years ago they were at the center of a controversy about how the Earth's crust was formed. It was in the 1780s that Abraham Gottlob Werner formalized his new theory that was to have worldwide significance for the new science of geology. And these basalt columns were the key to that theory. This film explores the historical context of Werner's ideas, and in particular the interaction between theory and practice in Saxony. And it provides us with a case study of the emergence of a particular scientific idea. Saxony is bounded to the south by what today we call Czechoslovakia, but in Werner's time was called Bohemia. A vast complex of ore mountains, the Erzgebirge, provided a natural boundary to the south, to Bohemia, and on this side the mountains fall away steeply. But on the Saxon side, especially around Freiberg, the hills are much gentler. Our case study of Werner's theory starts with the plentiful ore deposits of the Erzgebirge. Beneath the Saxon hills, there used to be one of the richest sources of silver in the world, especially in the area around Freiberg. Already by the 16th century, there was a long tradition of silver mining. It was hard and difficult work. The actual technique of removing the silver-bearing ore from the veins was very basic. The miner plus hammer and chisel. It was basic but effective, worked out from practical experience, and it remained the same up into the 20th century when this mine was still worked. Dr. Rainer Sennewald explains the problems the miners faced.
Die Arbeit für die Bergleute unter Tage war sehr beschwerlich. Das Gestein war recht fest hier im Freiberger Revier und es war auch sehr schwierig, die Stellen zu finden, wo viel Erz vorhanden war. Normal war es so, dass der Bergmann sehr viel Gestein herausarbeiten musste, ehe er wenig Erz fand. Diese Strecken sind für das 16. bis 18. Jahrhundert typisch und der Bergmann hat hier allein vor Ort gearbeitet und hat in der Woche etwa 25 bis 35 Zentimeter die Strecke vorgetrieben.
Even silver-rich stone like this yielded only minute quantities of silver. Visible here as twisted grey strands. Slow work, but worth it because of the great value of silver. By the 16th century, the culture of silver mining was both valued and wealth-producing, as this Saxon altarpiece, which was completed in 1526, illustrates. The actual mining of the silver may have been a basic technique, but the rest of the process was technologically advanced, a well-established system developed over centuries of practical experience. When the ore was brought to the surface, it was then dressed, broken up into manageable pieces, and then washed and graded, ready for the metal to be extracted from the ore in the smelter's furnaces. This smelting process provided silver metal, which was then made into the object of the exercise, coins of the realm. Practical knowledge was supplemented by a religious element. Here, according to legend, Anna, the patron saint of miners, tells the miner Knapp where to dig for silver. And mystical forces could also be called on to lead the divining rod to silver deposits. "400 years earlier, Duke Otto, the ruler of Saxony, played a decisive role in encouraging mining. He claimed ownership of all underground areas and decreed that in return for paying him a tithe, anyone had the right to mine, regardless of who owned the land above, so giving the town its name, Freiberg, free mountain, or free mining. Shafts were rapidly sunk and the town grew up on top of the silver deposits, and for 4 centuries Freiberg and the rest of Saxony enjoyed unrivaled wealth. But by the middle of the 16th century, the silver deposits near the surface were exhausted. There were good deposits deeper down, but going deeper presented the miners with a problem. Professor Eberhard Wächtler explains.
Das Problem des Erzgebirges ist, dass es nach Süden, nach Böhmen, nach der Tschechoslowakei zu, einen Steilabfall hat, während es sich nach Sachsen zu, das heißt nach Leipzig zu, in einem sehr flachen Winkel abfallen lässt. Das bedeutet für den Bergbau Folgendes, wenn wir uns das so vorstellen, dass man von Böhmen aus vorwiegend mit Stollenbergbau die Erzlagerstätten erreicht, während man auf der sächsischen Seite sehr bald, wenn man die Oberfläche abgebaut hat, mit tiefen Schächten einwirken muss. Diese tiefen Schächte bedingen natürlich dann Technik, Wasserräder, Kraftübertragung, und dazu braucht man ein Energiesystem.
The main problem in the deeper mines was flooding in the shafts and tunnels. The solution was ingenious, to bring yet more water into the mines. The water was collected in a series of artificial lakes and directed down the hillside from lake to lake in specially constructed water channels. This was all built over 400 years ago, in the 1560s, and is still in use today. It may look simple, but it's actually a very sophisticated solution to the problem of drainage. The water channels were carefully dug to control the flow of water, and there is a consistent drop of 1 meter for every kilometer. To achieve this, a precise understanding of the way the land fell was needed, so that its contours could be exploited to get this gentle and controllable flow. When the water reached a mine, it could be directed to a water wheel. This water wheel operated a pump to bring water up from below. In turn, this water could be used to power a further water wheel and pumps lower down. Inside the complex of mines, there was one main water channel, or adit, which ran underneath the whole system. Then, individual channels from each mine fed water into the main adit, with the water often passing through several mines on its underground journey. This vast tunneling system was hewn through solid rock, an amazingly accurate and precise achievement for the 16th century surveyors. This drainage system linked all the mines in the area, and the water channels were also used as tunnels to get about underground. Eventually, the water, which had been used to provide energy, possibly several times, flowed out of the mines. And from here, it could be directed to another mine lower down to start the process all over again. This complete, integrated and sophisticated system covered a vast area around Freiberg.
Dieses System war nur möglich, indem der Landesherr mit seiner Macht dazu die Voraussetzungen schuf. Über 100 Kilometer von Ost nach West und von Süd nach Nord waren es 60 Kilometer. Das bedeutet, dass der grundbesitzende Adel gezwungen werden musste und die Bauern in ihren Wäldern, auf ihren Feldern, Teiche, Kanäle, Bräuchen und anderes zuzulassen.
The ruler of Saxony had guaranteed the future of silver mining, the state's main wealth-producing asset, by this unique technological development.
This complex system needed an administration to run it, and in 1542 the ruler set up a mining civil service in Freiberg. It was important in the continuing prosperity of the state, and by the 18th century it was formalized and part of the courtly tradition. The mining civil service had an obvious economic function: to make possible more silver extraction and therefore create more wealth for the ruler. It controlled all aspects of the metal mining process, from surveying the mines to the miners themselves through to the minting of the coins. But an important legacy was its stimulus to technical education, for it required well-trained staff. It was this emphasis on technical training that led to the foundation of the Mining Academy in Freiberg in 1765. The head of the mining civil service wrote to the ruler of Saxony with a plan to regenerate the mines through technical education. Within 10 days of receiving the letter, the ruler authorized the setting up of the Mining Academy, and a detailed master plan was drawn up. The speed of the royal response was due no doubt to his desire to reconstruct after Saxony's defeat in the 7 Years' War. Advertisements were placed worldwide for students for this new institute. An early student at the Mining Academy was Abraham Gottlob Werner, attracted there no doubt by his strong interest in mineralogy. He then went to Leipzig to complete his studies, and in 1774 he returned to the Mining Academy as a professor. Today, Freiberg Mining Academy remains an important international center for the study of all aspects of mining.